Hello everyone, I'm Caitlin Teeter, and on today's Teeter Tales, I'm going to be doing a review of Shark Heart: A Love Story by Emily Habeck. Shark Heart is Habeck's debut novel, and it is magical realism, but also literary fiction. I will have chapters in the description if you want to go to certain parts of the review, and I will try to avoid spoilers as much as possible, but there are a few points where I'll start to go into spoilers, and you can look in the description for timestamps to skip the spoilers. Let's start the review. Shark Heart has a very unique premise, which is a large part of why I decided to read this book, with the book beginning with newlyweds Ren and Lewis learning that he has a mutation which is going to transform him into a great white shark within the year. The book is kind of unique in that it is split up into different sections, and it bounces between a variety of writing styles throughout. Sometimes you'll have standard narration, and other times it will go to more of a play format, or even have it set up like a note or as text messages. I'll start by saying Habeck is definitely a skilled writer. She is able to write some blunt, straight to the point sentences, but is also able to write poetically and philosophically. She also pulls off the different writing styles really well, and I think a strength of the book is how it can bounce between standard narration, play formatting, notes, and it really benefits the story. They work together seamlessly and also kind of have some connections to the characters and where they're at in their story. One element that she also plays with that I don't think she did very well is playing with the chronological order of the story. The first part of the story is told in roughly chronological order. You never jump ahead from the present moment, but you will sometimes have jumps into the past, and the past narratives are not told chronologically. So you'll get one part of Lewis's backstory, and then you'll maybe get some of Ren's time in college. Then you'll get Lewis's time right before he married Ren, and then you'll get Ren's time from as a small child. And rather than helping me feel like these characters were being fleshed out or I was getting invested in them, it made me actually not as interested in them because I felt like I didn't really know them, and I was supposed to care about what was happening to them without knowing their stories ahead of time. That's why I was a lot more engaged in Angela, Ren's mother, because the middle portion of the book goes back and tells her story, and it does so in a completely chronological way, which I felt really benefited me getting attached to her, unlike Ren and Lewis. Now I'm going to talk about a spoiler for a bit on the jumping around that the book does. For the latter part of the story, I actually feel like it could have done a bit more jumping around, and that would have helped it. Because once Lewis is fully transformed into a shark, you get a section about Lewis and then a section about Ren, with no splitting up or bouncing between the two. I actually felt that could have been better executed if Lewis and Ren's stories were interconnected and she bounced between their two stories. This may have been Habeck's way of showing that they were completely separated now, but it took me out of their relationship even more than I already was. The pacing was also odd in the book. It felt like Lewis and Ren's relationship and Lewis's transformation was really rushed and skimmed over when that's the main draw of the book. The hook Habeck uses is Lewis's mutation, and yet it would skip over weeks or even a whole month at a time, and Lewis would go from being mostly human to suddenly being half shark in the span of just a couple pages, and that was really frustrating for me because I wanted to know what happened in that time. Whereas the pace really slowed down at parts that I felt weren't even that important, like elements of Lewis's and Ren's backstory. For some more spoilers, I had a lot of questions that were left unanswered by the end of the book, and I don't know that it was intentionally unanswered. One example is how much people are still mentally there once they fully transform. Throughout the book, it made it sound like people, once they transform, their minds also become animalistic and the person is essentially gone. But Lewis becomes a shark and is still fully mentally human. And it never played with that idea, or the idea that maybe other people who have mutations still maintain their human mind. But it was glossed over. Same thing happened with the end of Angela's story. It set up this dilemma of would she be euthanized once she fully transformed, or would she be sent to Indonesia? And the book never answers that question. Ren just says her mother is gone, but that's unclear if that means sent to Indonesia or euthanized. And I really wanted to know the answer to that question, it was just never addressed. There were also random plot points that didn't really seem to contribute much to the overall story. Again, some spoilers in this, but some examples were the tiny pregnant woman, the story with Rachel and Ren, and also the random guy that Ren met outside of the bar. They didn't seem to add that much to the story and were just there. The characters were honestly a really weak point of this book for me. I found most of the characters to be really boring and I didn't really get invested in them. The characters I was most interested in were actually characters like Angela and George, who didn't really matter to the story in the long run. It felt like the side characters got more fleshed out than the main characters, which is a problem when this book is set up to be based around a love story. The main character of the book was actually also confusing. At first, it seemed like an even balance between Lewis and Ren, and then once it hit Angela's story and everything after that, it felt like Ren was very much the main character of the book, which is a problem because Ren was the most boring character in the book for me. I did not really care about her. She had a bland personality. And the most interesting part of her backstory was Angela's story, not even Ren's own story. Lewis could have been an interesting character, but it felt like too much of his transformation was glossed over, that we were told he was one person when his personality was something else by the end of the transformation, so there was a disconnect with him the whole time. There's quite a bit to talk about with this content guide, and I'll go ahead and start with the sexual content. While it doesn't ever really get very explicit, it does pop up occasionally. Usually it's reserved to things like mentioning Lewis and Ren moving in together, some cuddling between them, or frequent mentions that Angela had a teenage pregnancy. There are a few notable scenes that are a bit more intense, though. One of those is Marcos and Angela having an extended conversation about Angela losing her virginity when she is only 15. Another one is a spoiler, but Ren has a very uncomfortable scene when she is drunk and she kind of gets together with this other drunk guy at a bar. There's a scene where they go and make out, which is a bit more descriptive, and then she sleeps in his truck with him, but it's really unclear if they actually have sex, but it's still an uncomfortable scene. The relationships are really more where I would take issue with this book. The first is actually one that's not necessarily portrayed as problematic, but I was uncomfortable with. Ren strikes up a relationship at just the age of 19 with her professor, Rachel. This felt weird to me because it's said that Rachel is at least a decade older than Ren, and it felt almost like grooming to me that a much older professor started a romantic relationship with her student, but the book doesn't necessarily portray it as creepy or weird. One that is actually portrayed as problematic in the book and is meant to be uncomfortable, and very much is so, is Marcos and Angela's relationship. It's unclear how much older Marcos is than Angela, but it makes it very clear that he took advantage of how naive and young she is to use her essentially to have sex. He then begins to be emotionally and physically abusive to her, manipulating her and trying to make her feel guilty so she'll stay with him, even going so far as bruising her and leading to her breaking her arm. If anyone is uncomfortable with situations of abuse, this book does really kind of go into the abuse that Marco shows towards Angela. Language pops up in this book as well, and while it's not frequent, it can get a bit rough. For the first section, I think there was only one profanity, although it was a bit stronger, but the section with Angela does have a decent amount of swearing, largely from Marcos, which involves using God and Jesus' names in vain, and also some stronger profanities, usually in outbursts. Violence isn't that big of an issue in this book, although it can be a bit disturbing at points. The whole violence section is going to have some spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers for the book, you might just want to skip the violence section. Lewis's mutation is described to be very painful, and there are several points where it describes his bones breaking and kind of re-knitting together as cartilage. So that pops up frequently in the first part of the book. It will also describe him eating these big kind of grisly meals of raw meat while he's in the middle of his mutation. Same goes for Angela with her mutation. And I think one of the more disturbing moments in the book is Ren coming home to discover that Angela has eaten the neighbor's golden retriever. It describes a bloody collar, I think, being on the floor, and doesn't really go into any gory details, but makes it clear that it's a disturbing moment. There's also a point where Lewis injures himself and others while in the middle of his transformation. And obviously, there's the elements of physical abuse that Marcos shows to Angela, which has various injuries resulting from it. There is some drug and alcohol content also in this book. Characters drink and occasionally get drunk. And then Marcos, who is meant to be a problematic character, is said to frequently be high, doing drugs, or be drunk. Another sensitive topic that might bother people is suicide does come up and is discussed in this book. There's even a character who tries to commit suicide but then changes their mind and decides not to. And suicide is discussed a few times. I want to take a moment to talk about the worldview of Sharkheart because it's confusing, although that might be part of the point. Lewis and Angela are both clearly meant to be spiritual characters who believe in a higher power, but there's no clear origin or deity that they attribute it to. Christian beliefs also are discussed not too infrequently in both neutral and negative ways. Sometimes characters will contemplate if God is real, if God cares. Other times they'll flat out critique Christian morality. Ren is essentially an atheist with no belief system, but there is an odd moment where she prays to one of her mother's friends. Characters also wonder if the universe is random, or if it's intentionally cruel, or if there's a point to life. And other spiritualities are also referenced. There's an early allusion to chakras and things like that. The book also just generally has a pretty pessimistic feel, although, spoiler, it does end on a more hopeful note than I anticipated. Sharkheart is definitely an interesting read, but I had very mixed thoughts on Habeck's novel. I thought it had a lot of potential to it, and I was actually pretty excited to read it, even though it was an odd premise, but I feel like it failed to live up to that potential. It seemed like it was torn between being good literary fiction and good sci-fi or even body horror. Lots of metaphors were used in this book, but because it was torn between that sci-fi and literary fiction space, it never fully worked as metaphors. Along the same lines, the premise of mutations and the fact that they are known about in the world was really interesting, and I would love to see it explored. But because the book is interested in exploring grief and relationships and not that mutation element, it doesn't live up to that potential. There are also some frustrating lapses in scientific accuracy. This is me being a bit nitpicky, but one thing that took me out of it a bit at the start was the emphasis on Lewis knowing there was something wrong because his nose was becoming cartilage. It was odd because Habeck focused on a part of the human body that actually does have cartilage. I'm assuming she was referring to the small bone part of the nose at the very top, but it was just weird to see that part emphasized when there is cartilage in the nose. But again, this is me being nitpicky because of my biology background. Another thing that was a bit frustrating was the plot twists of the book were really easy to see coming. From, spoiler, the first time that Angela was mentioned, I knew that she probably had a mutation because it never said that she died. Ren just kept saying that she lost her mom. So I was not surprised when it was revealed that Angela had a mutation, so that was kind of disappointing that the book played it up as a big reveal. The book was definitely entertaining to read. I went through it very quickly, but I was disappointed with it. The most interesting storylines for me and characters were not the main focus of the book, and that was frustrating. I would recommend this book to someone who wants a unique read and wants to be able to discuss this with someone because it does lead to a lot of discussion, but won't mind a very imperfect read that can often be confusing and frustrating. In the end, Sharkheart had a lot of potential to it, but I feel like it didn't fully commit to either of its genres, which hurt a lot of its ideas and themes. I hope this review is helpful for you and gives you an idea on if you would like to read Sharkheart, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the book if you have read it in the comments. Bye!